Hello everyone. Today I've got Anthony Wilson from ABM Risk Management with me. Anthony spent over 30 years in senior executive roles, particularly focusing around risk and audit. And most of his career was spent in the retail environment at Australia's largest retailer, Woolworths. So he was Chief Risk Officer and Chief Audit Executive there. And since 2016, he's consulted to several public and private companies and to a number of government departments as well. And he is enthusiastic. He's committed in assisting organisations realise their true potential through great risk management, which he believes protects and creates value. Anthony, welcome to Cutting Through. Great to have you with me.
Thanks, Devin. A real pleasure to be here.
No, an absolute delight to have you, and thank you for inspiring me to actually do this. It's I'm really enjoying getting going with it all. So thank you.
It's a bit addictive. It is a bit addictive. So enjoy the journey.
Yeah, and I've interviewed a few people before and just really enjoyed it. I hadn't thought of doing a proper podcast, so thank you for that. Risk management. That when I emailed recently to the people who received my emails, I got outstanding opens on this topic. I got something like 60% of people who received my emails opened it. So that said to me that this was a really important topic to the people in my world. And that also motivated me to interview you and learn a bit more about your discipline. And so why don't you give us just a bit of a quick 30 seconds on your career to help everyone get to know you, and then we can dive into some of your cutting through challenges.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Devin. So as you said, 30 plus years at Woolworths, and people might say, well, that's a bit narrow, a bit shallow, but I was very fortunate in that I got to do a lot of things inside the organisation. So whilst it was a long time in one organisation, it was multiple different career streams. So liquor licensing, HR, operational management, major projects. So I ran Project Refresh, lots of different exposures in there, and finishing up, as you said, as the Chief Risk Officer and the Chief Audit Executive. So lots of different variety there. Been out consulting since 2016. And been doing all sorts of things there with a multitude of different clients. So infrastructure, other retailers, hospitality, government, all sorts of different clients. So a great exposure, very exciting actually.
Yeah, no, I can tell you love it, it's wonderful to speak to people who are enthusiastic about their work. And what I was gleaning from your little bit of history there was that you haven't always been a risk executive.
No, that's right. So
in operational roles, so you really understand your stakeholders better than perhaps many risk or compliance people.
Yeah. So, I've only been doing risk management now for, say, just over 12, 14 years. And that has come about as a result of the Chief Risk Officer role, obviously at Woolworths. And I was so interested in it, I went and did my master's degree in risk management at the University of New South Wales. So I wanted to make sure that I balanced my operational experience and understanding of the commercial realities of running a business. So one of the things I think risk managers have got to do is bring some business acumen. But I wanted to balance that with a bit of the theoretical side of risk management, because if you're going to do this, you've got to be able to address both sides, not one or the other.
And I think that actually dives us straight into one of the bigger challenges with communicating or engaging decision makers about risk management, because it is a bit of a leaky roof problem. Unless the roof leaks, it's pretty hard to get attention to these kinds of issues. And yet it sounds to me like you take a very proactive view of this. So perhaps can you share with us an example of where you've needed to cut through on something you think is really significant in this space? And what were the levers you pulled? What did you do? What worked?
Yeah, it's an ongoing challenge, and I guess risk management's not alone as a profession in trying to get cut through with leadership, and it often the old saying is never waste a good crisis. And things like the Banking Royal Commission, coronavirus, the various natural catastrophes we've had around New South Wales specifically, but right across the nation, suggests that there's been plenty of crises. So there is an awareness now with management and leadership of risk management. And I think there is now a growing awareness that, hey, we need to be across this stuff. We need to understand what could happen and that we need to be prepared for it. So I guess the difficult conversation that we have with leadership is that it's not a one-shot idea. It's not a project. You're not going to put 6 weeks, 6 months into this and say, right, risk management's done, tick that box, walk away. This is an ongoing change management exercise. So bringing risk management into the organisation, establishing the baselines, frameworks, risk appetite statements, all of the tools and processes, and then most importantly, embedding it in the organisation. So working with the various business unit teams to upskill them to be able to do this on an ongoing basis. So we have a limited number of clients at ABM Risk Partnership, mainly because we work with them over the long term. Right? And to be effective, it needs to be a longer term investment. So I guess the successes we've had is where we've been able to convince the leadership team that if they invest in this, they're removing some uncertainty from their decision making. Now, you can't ever guarantee that it's always going to work, but you reduce the uncertainty. And that's an attractive thing for management to take to boards and say, we're addressing uncertainty and escalating the chance of achieving our objectives by putting in some risk management disciplines.
Terrific. And so what I'm hearing from you there is a lot about also being proactive, and that notion of removing risk of calamity, which puts you in a real firefighting, literal potentially in a strange context, but in a business sense, firefighting around problems, and leaves you reactive and downing tools on things that are important and focusing only on things that are really critical and urgent. So you're suggesting that notion of prevention, of maintaining momentum in the business, avoiding big disruption is an important message to cut through.
Yeah, and one of the things you'll hear about, Davina, and hopefully your listeners will hear about as well, or have heard about, is the bow tie methodology. So named because it looks like a bow tie, but it's very simple, and it makes it very easy for people to grasp what we're trying to do when we think about risk management. So on the left-hand side of the bow tie are the potential causes of the risk. And once you've identified the causes, you can then think about preventing controls. So what can we do to reduce the likelihood of this thing happening? In the middle is the risk itself described. On the right-hand side of the bow tie are the consequences. So if this risk does eventuate, what are the things that could happen? What's the impacts, the consequences we're going to face? And once you've got that clarity, you can start to develop mitigating controls. Now, once you've got that picture, you can start to evaluate and say, well, I know now which are the really critical controls, the ones I need to guarantee are in place and are effective, because they are the ones that are going to cause you dramas if they're not. So there's that prevention piece. You'd rather the risk not happen at all if it was avoidable. But then you might have something like a flood where as an organization, you can't do much about it yourself. So you've got to have response capability. And that response capability we call business resilience. So it might be emergency response. It might be one site affected. There might be, a flood, a fire or whatever. And site management effectively steps up and does the emergency response. It might be what we call business continuity, where a critical facility is lost, say a distribution center or a data center. And we need to think about, well, that thing's burnt down. Where are we going to operate from now? It could be IT disaster recovery. So we've had an Optus this week, a major data breach.
10 million names and details.
Yep, absolutely. So hopefully there's an IT disaster plan in place and they're working to that now. Or more importantly, probably where they're at is the crisis management, the fourth element of business resilience. So something's happened and it's of such a scale that it's going to damage the reputation of the business. It's going to severely impact operations. It could harm people or property. So, those are the sort of things we talk about being ready to respond. All right. That's a short synopsis anyway.
Yes, no, that's fabulous. That's helpful. And one thing that I can imagine decision makers being concerned about is how to get the balance right because there's a risk with risk management, if you'll pardon the double up there, that it becomes a bureaucratic burden. And I imagine that's a challenge that you get presented with quite a lot. How do we get the right balance here between being so safe we can't do anything, and we're so tied up in knots with red tape, versus being completely free and at risk of being completely exposed? How do you deal with that trade-off?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Davina. And it even starts, and before I go to your specific question, it even starts when you set up the risk management framework for the organisation. It has to be bespoke to that organisation's culture, its objectives, the way that it operates. It has to be very specific. So, we're not a Big Four consulting firm. We don't walk in with a template and say, here's all the answers to everything. We actually sit and listen first. What is it the organisation does? How do you go about your business? What's the culture of the organisation? What's the view of the executive? What's the view of the board? We try to build a picture of the organisation. And then as we start to develop the framework, we know that it resonates with that organisation's culture. Then to the point that you're asking about decision-making, how do you be not too far one way that you lock the business down and it can't operate, or you're too far the other way where you're too loose and risks will occur and people could get hurt, all those sort of things. And that's really defined by the risk appetite statement. So the risk appetite statement will be, and I always use the analogy of the red and yellow flags at the beach, right? They set the parameters. And if you as a person working in the organization, as an executive making decisions in the organization, even as the CEO, if you operate between the flags, then you're protected. The board knows you are operating within the parameters that they have set. Not too much risk, and most importantly, not too little risk. Because risk management is about taking risk, and doing business and being successful at business is taking risks. So the board will want you to take certain risks, but there'll be boundaries about that. So if you can operate between the flags, you're safe. If you go outside the flags, you're on your own. There's nobody there to rescue you. If you get in trouble, it could be really bad for you. Now, that's the sort of analogy that we think about and talk to organizations about. And the risk appetite statement is the manifestation of that concept.
No, that's terrific. No, I can see that. And so what are the hardest things to encourage a leadership group to include in their risk appetite statement, let's say?
That's a really good question. And again, it has to be really bespoke to the organisation. So if you're talking to a gas infrastructure company, that's going to be a hell of a lot different to a retailer or to a government department and those sort of things. So what we tend to do is once you start the process of working through the organization's risks, and we tend to do a top-down and bottom-up approach. So we'll work with each of the business units of the organization or the government department, and then we'll get the executive group together and do the same thing. We'll do a workshop with that group, and then we'll pull those things together, and we'll start to get a bit of a view about where there are commonalities in thinking between executive and business unit, or where there are differences. And we'll explore those differences and try and resolve those with the team. Once you've got that, you'll have a list of risks. And some people get a bit scared about the number. I mean, it could be hundreds, right? Doesn't really matter. The idea of these are brainstorming sessions. You want them just to throw things out there. The quantification analysis and all of that sort of stuff happens later on. But once you get that list of risks, you can then start to see patterns. Right. And we start to call these the risk categories. And those categories generally inform your appetite statement. So you might have a category like people and culture, right? That'll happen everywhere, I would almost guarantee. And within that can be things like your safety, your recruitment, your retention, your remuneration, benefits, code of conduct, behaviors, all of those sort of things come under that risk category of people and culture. So your question was the challenge of getting some in there. And sometimes the one where we find a little bit challenging is when you go to the core business of the organization. So let's say operations as a broad label. some of those people will say, well, what would you know about our business? You can't make up a risk statement that matches our appetite in terms of operations. But the challenge then is always just to get them on board and to say, well, okay, that's fine. We don't know exactly what you do, and certainly not in the detail that you do it, but talk to us about what are the risks. And the question we ask, sometimes we don't even use that R word. We say, what has to go right for you to achieve your objectives? And then what could go wrong? Right. And have them just have a discussion. And when you're having a discussion, they're telling you all the things that are risks anyway, without even realizing it. So that's sometimes the it's not headbutting. We don't have, violent disagreement, but it's just trying to get them engaged on the journey. And once they are, they're generally pretty keen.
I like the way you're thinking about that. So what is it that has to go right here for you to operate? And then what gets in the way of that? So you're really coming into their world. And look, I think when people are resistant, questions are often a terrific way. And people always like talking about their situation and their circumstances. And I can see here too, when you're talking about top down and bottom up, there are some challenges there too. Perhaps you engage the senior people and they are more aware of the consequences of things going wrong. And then you've got the people on the shop floor or middle management who think, oh, I've been here forever. We've always done that's just head office nonsense. We don't have to worry about that. And that speaks to culture. But how do you actually deal with that? Because I think that might be quite pervasive in a lot of places.
Yeah. One of the things that we find wins us a lot of fans internally in a business is when we have the discussion about the possible consequences. So if they've been involved in any sort of risk management exercise in the past, they typically have been told that the consequence is financial, right? And, we could lose money, or, we could get a fine, or, there's all these financial things that we talk about. But when we set up a set of what we call the risk metrics for an organization, financial is the very last thing we talk about. So we talk about what consequence could you have on your day-to-day operations? Would customers be disadvantaged? Would your stores, if you're in retail, not be able to open? Would you not be able to send electricity across the grid? Right? So what's the operational impact? What's the reputational impact that might happen if you have this risk occur? What's the regulatory or compliance impact if this risk to occur? What about health and safety? Could somebody be harmed with this thing? What impact could it have on your long-term strategic objectives if the risk emerged? And then finally, what could be the financial impact? All right. Now, smart people will know that all of those could have a financial impact as well. But we actually start people thinking about those other consequences first. And it just changes the game a little bit, because they get, oh, actually, that's right. This could impact our customers, forgetting the financial thing for a bit, which ultimately will become a financial risk. But they're thinking about the things that matter to them day to day, and not just the straight dollars.
And that's key with almost anything, isn't it? What's in it for me? How will this impact me?
Absolutely.
How will this impact my KPIs? Oh gosh, does that mean I'll be fighting fires and not able to deliver on this input, get enough widgets out of the warehouse, or deliver enough customer satisfaction, or whatever the dimensions are that they're measured in? Yeah, no, I hear you on that. And I think this might be a good point to sort of show up Anthony's risk management matrix. You can see a whole lot of things there if you're watching the video. If not, you're welcome to download it. I'll share the link for that at the end of the podcast. But we have here a very large matrix of risk things, don't we? Talk to us a little bit about this. We've got, and I did love, by the way, that stakeholder management was right near the top left corner, so it jumps off the page. I thought that was pretty awesome from my own selfish perspective. But we've got here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories, and then 11. So we've got 55 different elements here, which are part of a comprehensive risk management program. Which one of these do people forget most often?
Well, it varies depending on maturity. And that's one of the things we do with clients first up, is measure their risk management maturity. But that document Davina, it performs a very important function. And if I can digress for one moment, ABM Risk Partnership has three partners, Brett Palmer and myself, specialising in the risk management space. Tony Anderson, our third partner, is an expert in competency and capability. And that document is our core competency map, if you like, to make sure that people who are going to have some exposure to risk management understand these things. Now, we don't expect everybody in the organisation to understand all 55 things of that, right? 90% of people in an organisation will only need what we call an awareness level, right? So they'll need to know that if they see something wrong, they should say something, right? That if they're responsible for a control or for a process being done, they need to do it, right? And if it's not working, they need to raise that issue. So most of the organisation just need to be aware, right, of what's going on with risk management. And then we go up through 4 levels, right up to mastery, right? So the mastery type people, believe it or not, it's not the CEO, right? It's the person that's the chief risk officer probably, or the head of risk, or whatever their title is, that really needs to be across all of these things that you see on that chart. Now, various people, so some of the executives, for instance, will have 30, say, of those 55, but they don't need to be experts at all. They need to understand. So we use that as a bit of that informs our maturity process to understand where organisations are at. Tony often tells us the story of a gas facility in Venezuela, where the team, I think 8 people working in the control room, had done their training, and they were deemed to be 87% trained through their, the various programs they had to do. Yet not one of them knew when to push the emergency stop button in the facility.
Oh,
so whilst they were trained,
13%.
they weren't competent. So competency is the skills, behaviors, attitudes, knowledge, and training that makes a person competent to do their job. So that's one of the things we do, and that document that you've just shown is a fundamental aspect of that.
Yeah, okay. And so going to that appropriate step, and I think you're talking about a very nuanced approach that's very specific and appropriate for different settings, different levels in an organisation, different types of organisations, and different levels of maturity as well. So what are when talking about changing and focusing on change management in an organisation, is it harder to cut through with the executives, or is it harder to cut through with the team? Where's the greatest?
That's a really good question. And again, it probably varies organisation by organisation, but if I was to generalise, the team tend to get it because they live it, and they see the consequences live. So if something happens, they know the customer's going to be impacted, or, they're the one that cops the abuse from the customer because something can't happen. If the system doesn't work, they're the ones that understand I can't get the stock I need, or I can't do the process I need to do. They're the ones that see the stuff on social media that says, I was just at such and such a location and they did that, So the team tend to understand the very practical impacts and consequences of the risk occurring. The executives, and by their very nature, need to be much more high level. So when we talk, and I mentioned earlier, hundreds of risks, and that might be a legitimate number for an organisation, the executives probably only want to talk about the ones we call the material risks. So for an organisation, that's going to be 10, 12, 15 risks that are material to the organisation. Material as in, if they occur, they could end the organisation. So these are the ones they really have to keep an eye on. You will always find safety, health and well-being in there, for instance, right? So those are the risks that the executives tend to focus on and be I guess, most aware of. Do they always get it? No, sometimes there's a little bit of convincing because they think I'm too busy to do this risk management stuff. But they come around because they realize, well, actually what I do day to day is risk management. Everything I'm doing, I'm making key decisions, I'm doing all that sort of stuff. Risk management processes help me make better decisions with more information. So they do come around. Sometimes it does take a little bit longer, but yeah, they get there.
Is that partly also because of proximity? They're further removed. Your people on the shop floor or operating the business are much closer to the real consequence of the risk. They're the ones who see it, who feel it. Whereas the senior execs are just, it's much more abstract for them, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the people in middle management are the ones that really get it, right? So they are close enough to the shop floor, as it were, to get the feedback. But they're also the ones that are responsible for those processes or controls or actions that we have to take to make sure risk management is effective. So they're the ones, and I guess that's why they tend to be the ones that we work with most closely. And from all of that work, we then go to the executive, talk about what the opportunities are, and then we have the discussion with the board. So middle managers are probably the ones that get it really quickly.
And so do you find that they're the ones who should present to the leadership team because they're the ones feeling it so they can speak with authenticity? Do you find that helpful, or are there other strategies that you've used?
Absolutely. Wherever we can, we would have those people present to the board. So there's not much good asking the risk person, what's going on with XYZ process. You might as well bring the person that is responsible for and owns that process, so the board can ask them directly. The board's question to the risk person should be, what assurance am I getting that this risk has been analysed correctly, that we know what controls are in place, we know which are the critical controls, we know that actions have been identified, and we know we're up to date with those actions. That's the question for the risk person, is more about the process. The actual detail about the specific risk should be the risk owner having that discussion. Now, sometimes we can do that. Other times the organisation doesn't want that. That's fine. We can work towards that.
And so then when you've got that middle level risk manager, let's say, preparing to speak to the board, do you find there's a challenge in getting those people to speak in truly hardcore business terms rather than technical risk terms? Do you find that gap hard to bridge?
Yeah, I mean, we'd much rather them talk in business terms, and wherever we can, we use the business terminology as well. So I spoke about setting up a bespoke framework for organisations. So we always develop a risk glossary, and as much as possible, it's using that organisation's terminology. So we don't want to pump in a whole heap of risk terminology. There's some you can't avoid, but where we can, we use the business's own terminology. So we'd much rather somebody from the business talk to the board in business language and not risk language.
Great. And do you find that that's an easy thing, or do you find you need to coach people in that? Because I find a lot of technical people find that quite a big step to make, to move out of their technical discipline and move into that, or be able to bring it forward in a thoroughly commercial sort of environment.
Yeah, and we've worked with a couple of organisations lately on cybersecurity, and Optus is going to make that even more focused.
Appropriate for today in Australia. Yes.
So in that space, you'll typically get the standards, the NISTs and all of those sort of global standards, which will give you hundreds of points to check from a cybersecurity point of view. It's too much for the board to consume. And you will get a technical person that will go, number 321.7.8 says, and that just doesn't work for a board, as you well know. So our job is to help with the thinking and the presentation of that into digestible and plain English category. So don't tell me about a problem with identity and access management. Tell me about who can access the system. Right? Yeah. So try and group those individual standard elements into some plain English things for the board, and by all means give them some comfort that we're 70% of the way through the standard, and we've got this much work to do, and there's the end date. But you've got to keep the discussion relatively high level with the board, because they've got so much they've got to get across. Yeah,
absolutely. No, I hear you. And so I guess another aspect to the challenge here is change fatigue too. These processes, if you've got a substantial shift to make, let's say in risk culture in an organisation, I've seen this firsthand in a big bank actually. And
Yeah.
developing the culture, the culture statement and everything that went with it took a very long time. But then implementing it and staying the course with it was actually, it was no small undertaking. What is your advice to people to help their, people on the shop floor, right through to middle management and senior levels, stay the course? Once you've started something and the excitement's worn off, they feel pretty safe now, they've had a good go at it.
Yeah.
And now there's actually still 70% of the work to do, let's say.
Yep.
Not new anymore.
That's a really good question, Davina. And one of the things that we try and do, and it's a hard habit to break, particularly if you are the sort of person that likes to help people and assist and, coach them along. Sometimes you've got to give a little bit of tough love, and you've got to say, well, I'm here to help you with the process, and I can supply tools and I can answer any questions you want, but you are the business person, you own the risk. So while I'm the expert at the process, you're the expert at the risk. So go out and manage that risk, identify your controls, develop the actions that you think need to be taken, put a date on it, assign an owner of that action. An incident occurs, go and investigate the incident, find out what happened. Because an incident, and I was going to talk about this later, but an incident is a really important aspect of risk management because a control failed.
Absolutely.
Right? So you thought something was working and it didn't. So you take that incident and you learn from it and say which control failed and why. Now, if you're having the same thing happen over and over and over again, you've got a major control problem, right? So you need to rectify that. And this is where you get the business on that change journey, because you're not out there saying we've got to do risk management, we've got to do risk management, we've got to do risk management. You're out there saying, hey, you've had an incident, go and investigate it. Hey, where are your controls at the moment? Are they effective? How do you know? You tell me you've got these controls in place. How do you know they're working? What are you going to do to provide that assurance? What incidents are there happening and how do they relate to the controls? Are your actions all up to date? So somebody that I interviewed once on my podcast, early days actually, said, I don't use the R word wherever possible. Right? This is a conversation about the business, right? And again, coming back to what needs to go right and what could go wrong.
Yes.
And that's how you just keep the business engaged. We do a couple of engagements, Davina, where instead of the organisation setting up their own risk function, we are the pseudo risk function. So we actually co-source. So for one day a week or whatever the situation is, I'm actually at the client's premises and people will come to me, or I will go and chase people and say, where are we at? How are you going with your actions? Do you need any help with the process? Those sort of things. And it just keeps it going because the business unit knows there's no one else but us to keep this process running.
Yes.
And they know the board is asking, they know the executive is looking for this stuff, and they know they've just got to go and do it. Fortunately, we've given them the tools and processes that build it into management's day job. It's not an additional thing to do. It's just doing your normal job.
Part of coaching your team and guiding your team and so on. And I'm hearing that balance of responsibility, which becomes central to any sort of leadership position, doesn't it? I'm not going to do everything for you. You're responsible. So, you're accountable, go deliver. And I guess this sounds awful, but just the occasional very sort of manageable incident is possibly a healthy thing to keep people's focus and, manage it well, good. But, oh gosh, we mustn't let this drop. Okay, we're a bit behind on developing a new set of things or covering new territory. We'd better hop back onto that. So maybe there's something useful about having some minor incidents or near misses, maybe even better, near misses, where people just go, oh gosh, yes, I must make sure that we do keep on that, because otherwise it's all a bit meh, isn't it? It's a little bit, set and forget, don't worry about it too much, unless maybe this is the good outcome, that people are so, got such good habits and everything's really ticking along very well. Do you see that very often?
Yeah. I think there's I said never waste a good crisis. An incident is a mini crisis, right? So something has happened, and it's an opportunity just to go back and check. Now, you can't do it for everything. And if you've got a good incident management system and you've got a good culture that says you're not going to get yelled at, or you're not going to get in trouble, or you're not going to, get roasted because you've reported an incident. As a matter of fact, you'll be rewarded for reporting incidents and keeping us in the loop. But then, from that filter of hundreds or thousands or whatever the number of incidents is, take the ones which, potentially could have been a really bad outcome. So we had a client where a pallet fell onto an office and squashed the office flat. Now, nobody in the office, thank goodness, but that could have killed someone.
A pallet,
right?
But a pallet, that was a very high pallet. So a pallet containing, was it coming through on a crane?
So it was being maneuvered on a lifting device, and, it dropped. Hit an office, squashed it. Fortunately, nobody in the office, but that's an incident that could have killed someone. So, okay, let's do a post-incident review. Let's have a look at all the controls we have in place, and let's have a look at what failed in that process. Now, what you might find is we're missing a control, right? So we've now got to go and do an action, and that is put in the new control that's going to do that. One thing that's really important, I think, for listeners too, Davina, is to make sure that in this process, you're also open to removing controls. Because one thing organizations are good at is putting controls in place. Something's happened, let's put in a control. Something's happened, let's put in a policy. Something's happened, let's invent a new process. But they're not very good at saying, why are we still doing this? It's not adding any value anymore. So you've got to be open to pulling controls or processes, or I once talked to an EA of a CEO, and I said, oh, that's a big report you're producing there. What do you do with that? And she said, oh, just stick it in the bottom drawer and hold on to it for 6 months, and then I throw it out. So it's an example of something that's been ingrained but is no longer doing what it was designed to do.
And do you see that particularly in the reporting space rather than on the shop floor? I can imagine the shop floor is much more agile and practical about that sort of thing. But I certainly see, like enormous forests of risk reports in some places, which I just wonder what happens with.
Absolutely. And it's not just risk reporting, it's reporting generally. There's things that people have done, and they've done them for so long that they just always do them. And I think sometimes you just got to step back and just say, well, what value is this adding? I mean, I think to your point about the shop floor or the factory floor or, the hospital setting or whatever it is, ask the people who are doing the job. Because what you'll generally find is there's processes that are just no longer relevant, or there's controls that just don't work, or more scarily, they will have workarounds because the design that head office gave them just does not work in the real world.
That's what I was assuming. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I can see that. And where you're going to the shop floor and asking people their questions, and then asking leaders their questions and aligning them, I think sounds like a great strategy for developing controls that people will adopt, that the message will cut through, both top down and bottom up, because it's relevant, because it's useful, because it has impact, it's valuable, which is the key thing, isn't it? So does your discipline, if you like, your field, possibly gets a bad name then from over-reporting and over-measuring?
There are certainly those out there that do that and think that if you've got heaps of bits of paper and it's got lots of pretty colours on it, then you must be doing risk management well. I'd counter that. You've got to start with any organisation. And I know I keep saying the shop floor, that's the retailer coming out of me.
It is, isn't it?
You've got to start on the shop floor. Unless you walk the tiles and understand exactly what it is the business does, then there's no way you can understand all of the risks to this organisation. So, be that, I mean, I've been in, as I said, infrastructure companies for gas and electricity, and I still go to the sites because you've got to understand the flashing lights and the dials and the wires and the big machines and those sort of things to get your head around what some of these risks are. Again, not because we become the risk expert, that's not the case at all, but you want to understand the basics of what the organisation does, and then you can start to help interact and eke out of the people what the big risks are.
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay. No, I hear you. I think that sounds like a really sensible approach. So if you were to leave our listeners with a couple of key gems, what would they be?
I think there's a few. One of them is that nexus between risk controls and incidents. So you might have identified the risk, you might have put all the controls in place, and you might be feeling pretty happy with yourself. But if you're not capturing and reporting on incidents, and importantly, filtering out those key incidents and actually investigating them, then you're going to miss a free kick. It's a free lesson to understand whether your risk analysis was correct. So is the risk actually a bit higher than what you thought it was because we're having all these incidents? Or was I too over the top with my risk and saying it was a very high risk when I don't have any incidents at all? So you need to make that connection. The incident analysis gives you a bit of a sanity check on how your risk is actually placed. I think the other thing that you have to do is make sure that you understand that this is a journey. You've got to change a concept that's in people's heads that, oh, these guys, or, we're going to internally do a risk management activity and it'll start on day X and it'll finish 6 weeks later. Risk management is not that. By all means, if you're doing a risk assessment, which is a component of a risk program, yes, it'll have a start and it'll have an end, and there'll be some deliverables out of that. But risk management as a program is a journey, and it's about change management. And it has to be, I guess the third thing, it has to be bespoke to your organization. So if you've got someone coming in and saying, look, I've got this thing, it's already built, you can just whack it into your business and away you go, just run 100 miles because it will not work.
No, that's fabulous. I think that's a wonderful place to wrap. So thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing so much wisdom with us. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And for those of you who may like to download Anthony's risk matrix, then please go ahead, visit our website at clarityfirstprogram.com/podcasts, and you'll be able to find it there. So thanks again, Anthony. And I look forward to talking to you again sometime soon.
Thanks, Davina. It was great. Good to talk to you again.